This is what happens when you don't give a Don Mai a second season. Hey! It's Romania Black. We're on chapters 5 and 6 of Scum Villains Self-Saving System. And you may be wondering, what the fudge is this? I am too wondering, what the fudge is this? Yeah, I apparently over the last week or so there's been this image shared. I'm sure there's equally disturbing things on the internet about Scum Villain. I just can't see them yet because I'm not very far into the series, but this was shared in the Discord and I was like, I don't understand. So I mean, I get it. It's this Shin naked thing that looks like a cat, a hairless cat that's kind of got like a sphinx face and got little teats. And then there's Ning Ying Ying and there's Ming Fan and then the most sad, like worm tongue esque from Lord of the Rings, Lo Binghe following behind him. I get what it means. It means that Shin is cultivating and taking care of these babies as if they're his disciples are his own little kittens. I can't fully support this because the idea that Shin is nursing Lo and I know some people like in the fanfic community probably would watch a fanfic that would have Lo nursing from Shin. What are we talking about? I don't know. And I thought that was it. I thought okay, that's it. That's it. It was just a blip in the matrix. It was a moment. It's gone. We're done. We're done with that. And then like an hour later, the fan art just started pouring in on Discord, and I was like, why is Shin a pound puppy? Why is Shin like that little like my puppy surprise? Like, why is this happening? And I was like, I don't like this. I know that there's some people in the fandom that this floats your boat. I'm probably on the ship adjacent to you right now. I'm not judging. I'm not firing cannons at you. I'm just cruising on by. Whenever I think of extremist groups, I think they think this is what the gay agenda is. And I'm like, they're all walks of life. I'm basically Shin in this one. How I felt these past few days. I don't know what to do. I've been told over and over again, I've been told that this fandom is the most feral of the MXTX fandom because they are the fandom with the least media. With Modao Zushi, there's a novel, there is an audiobook, there are 3 seasons of Donghua, there's a live action adaptation, there's a chibi series. Modao Zushi is the spoiled middle child that gets like everything. They get all of the things. And then with Heaven Official's Blessing, there is the novels, which is a very extensive series. There's now 2 seasons of the Donghua, and there's an audio drama they're working on, and they're working on a live action. So they're just one chibi series shy of getting the full exposure at the moment. And then you have poor Scum Villain Self-Saving System that just has the novel and one 10-episode series of the Donghua that was cut tragically short. And they're just like, what do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? Chalk drawings? I'm so excited to dive into this series, but I'm also like, oh my god, these poor fandoms, like, what else can they do? So I think it's hilarious, and I'm a bit concerned for the rabbit hole that I'm about to dive into. I'm a wee bit concerned about it, but what can we do? We've started now. We can't stop. We've got to just dive into the rabbit hole and see where the madness takes us. Apparently. But yeah, I've got some comments I want to talk about. Apparently Couscous was telling me on Discord that the reason why the Donghua was only 10 episodes was because the studio ran short of the budget. And I was like, well, judging by what some of those monsters look like the last couple episodes, I believe that. That sucks so much. Because yeah, I definitely see how knowing that we kept getting confirmation we were going to get to the edge of the abyss. And that was where the series it seemed like that was where the season was going to end, because Shin's character kept bringing it up like, oh, I don't want to go to the abyss. I don't want to kick Lo over in the abyss, but I think it's going to happen. So it led you to believe that, okay, that's where the season's headed. And it's either going to get us to the abyss and we're going to stop there and be like, oh no, now I got to wait till season 2 to see what happens and if he actually goes through with it, or to see if he actually does kick him into the abyss. That's what I was like. I kept being like, okay, we're going to get there. And then we just stopped as they're running away from spiders. It's like if Lord of the Rings, it's like if they'd gotten to Shelob's lair in Lord of the Rings and then it just stopped. And you'd be like, well, wait, what? What about the rest of it? So yeah, I feel for the Donghua. I don't think that there are any more Donghua only people for Scum Villain self-saving system. I think it was the best marketing ploy in the world to get you to go buy the novels, because they were like, now you gotta watch it, because you get invested and then you're like, well, what am I gonna do? So before we dive into these comments, I do want to talk about a couple things. Some things that I went back and re-listened to the discussion today, or me basically, not necessarily the discussion, but me reading chapters 1 through 4 and going over that again. And I realized that I left some things off of Conspiracy Board Sama, who is over here in the wings. You can't really see him. One thing that I left out was the idea of the magic finger. This is my horrible attempt at drawing a magic finger. This was actually my first attempt, which I was meaning it to be flipping off the camera, but now it looks like either a pork chop or it looks like something that would be involved with the skinless cat shin. So we're gonna go with the magic finger on this side instead. But yeah, we're gonna go with this version, and basically they just said a magic finger that can solve everything. Whatever the hell that means. It's brought up in the first paragraph of the novel, basically, and it's never spoken of again. So I'm going to put this on the Conspiracy Board Sama as like, we're going to watch for the magic finger and see what the hell happens with that. Because it seems like it's going to be like a Deus Ex Machina that's going to come out of nowhere like 4 volumes from now. So we're just going to put this on the board, put it off to the side, not worry about it at the moment. Then the other thing that I had not put on to Conspiracy Board Sama was the B points, the badass points. I was thinking by B points, like B side of a record, like we have, you know, what's going on in the novel, and then the Scum Villain self-saving systems, kind of like the behind the scenes. So the B side, no, it's badass points. But there are basically 4 things that Shin must do, and I'm going to put this on Conspiracy Board Sama so we can keep track of it. 1 is change the nonsensical plot and raise the IQ of the villains and supporting side characters. So, one thing that Shin was complaining about right before he was isekai'd into this novel was that all the characters were dumb and made dumb choices, and that the plot had a lot of plot holes and needed to be fixed, and it was conflated and blah, blah, blah. Which, thinking about it now, I feel like, 1, this is going to be a way for MXTX, because when you hear that the original story is like 1,000,000 chapters and goes on forever, I was like, well, this entire novel series is only 4 volumes. So it's not like Heaven Official's Blessing where it goes on a long time. So I'm like, what are we going to get the full story? But if the plot is changing as we go, and if certain decisions that Shin and the others make change the plot, then it very well could have the story go from being like 1,000 chapters down to the 4 novels that we have. That makes more sense. So changing the nonsensical plot is tidying it up, which is what Shin said he was going to have to do and was kind of frustrated by it. Second is to avoid landmines that break the suspense of disbelief. That's the one I'm most curious about. Like, this first part makes sense, and we've kind of seen this in action in the Donghua already. And then number 3, you know, ensure the main character's satisfaction points are maintained. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Woohoo! Yeah, we've seen that in action as well, whether Shin is aware of it or not. And then 4, you know, discover and finish the hidden plot events. Well, we're getting those accomplished as well. So far, things are happening, but the whole avoid landmines that break the suspension of disbelief, that's the only one of the 4 that I'm like, I don't know what you mean by that. The cool thing about the novel versus the Donghua is we are in Shin's head, so we are getting his understanding because he's kind of an otaku and he's read a lot of isekai before, so he kind of knows the lingo. We're gonna get probably him explaining these four as we go through the novel, which I'm really excited about. So yes, that part has me excited to see where we go to from here. So I'm gonna put this terrible finger and this onto Conspiracy Board Sama to have with us as we follow along. I can see Conspiracy Board Sama from here, but I'll probably take a picture of it and tie back into it by the end of the video. But we're basically going to use Whiteboard Kun, I've decided, for a lot of our discussion. We're going to use Whiteboard Kun, and then what I'm going to do is anything that I feel needs to transfer from Whiteboard Kun to Conspiracy Board Sama, who will always be in the wings within eyesight where I can look at it. We will be able to transfer that, and then I'll probably take a picture as we go each week and put it on Discord if I'm thinking about it, if I remember to, and then just go from there. So, and my goal is that by the time we finish the entire novel series, Conspiracy Board Sama will be just filled with just notes and things. It will just be covered. That's my goal. And so then we have the live stream, we can like go over everything and talk about it, and it'll be a lot of fun. But that's my goal anyway. So yes. I think that bringing back Whiteboard Kun is going to be a much more solid choice and will let me kind of work in the moment. Conspiracy Board Sama is kind of more of a long game character in this series, whereas Whiteboard Kun's like our traveling companion week to week. So yeah. I do have some things I want to talk about before we get started though. First, Latchkey. Latchkey brought this up, and some other people have brought it up since starting the novel, and I was like, oh, And that was that the system said that only Lo can't die. Lo Binghe is the only character, our protagonist, that can't technically die. So in this, and my dogs are probably going to bark at a deer, so you'll have to excuse them. So Shin's, changes that he's made in the novel starting, they're going to start impacting. And the fact that only our main protagonist is guaranteed to be the one that lives by the end of this, it's fair game. Anybody can die. So Wanrong dying, I was like, oh my God, when did this, but she wasn't supposed to die, but she did. So that means it's like all bets are off. And I think that by the end of the Donghua, Shin was starting to realize that, like, oh shit, everything's going to change now. The novel is going to change. If one of your goals is to change the nonsensical plot, then yeah, some characters are going to die and some characters are going to live. That's changing the plot. So it's really cool, this idea that you think going into this that Shin's going to have it all in the bag. He's going to know what to do, know what to change. And even though he's unlocked the out of character function, he's not going to be able to predict a lot of things happening in the novel. And that's going to be really exciting to watch go down. So I was like, yes, of course. Awesome. So Anime Annie pointed out that Shin and Lo, they're very much in sync outside on the physical side, like in battle, like in episode 10 of the Donghua, we saw them like working together in sync really, really well. But internally, they are not in sync at all. Like Lo has the biggest crush on Shin, and Shin is just trying to keep from ending up in a pickle jar, or in the novel's case, having his arms and legs cut off and Lo hating him. So they are very much on different wavelengths internally, whereas on the outside, they work in sync and work really well together. And I told Anime Annie that it really struck me when she said that, because that's kind of how, not to get really into spoilers with the other two series, but with Modao Zushi and Heaven Official's Blessing, that's kind of how MXTX structures those couples as well. You have a pair of individuals that they really work together and have great chemistry, but internally, they are on totally different wavelengths. And the series is about them coming together and communicating and figuring out how to get on the same page. At least that's how the other two series were. We'll see how this one ends up. But I love that. And then, yeah, so I put on here abomination and additions to Conspiracy Board Sama. The abominations being what you saw at the beginning of this. And then the things for Conspiracy Board Sama, the golden finger and B points. So Reiki, like I told you all last week, I had Reiki go back through. I asked the Discord on Patreon if they could help me reorganize, because the original digital file that I had of the novel was not matching up with the page numbers in the book. And I was like, ugh, this could get a little bit dicey. So I'm super grateful for Couscous for allowing me to have the original file. thank you. That was super kind of you. But I want to give a special shout out to Reiki, who went back through and they were like, oh, it's fine. I'll just take the first volume and make you a PDF of it chapter by chapter. And I was like, that's really nice of you. Thank you very much for doing that. So special thanks to them, because that's really, really kind of them. But they not only did that, they're also, I was like, man, it kind of sucks because in this, they have the volume separated into 5 giant chunks, and they just have like this first chunk that we're reading is called Scum. I'm like, okay, but we don't get to see like the individual chapter names, because that was one of the fun things about Heaven Official's Blessing, is that the chapter names sometimes you get to and be like, oh my gosh. So on the one hand, Reiki said that they didn't have the chapter titles in the actual chapters themselves as I read, but when I go back and actually talk about the chapters, they're going to put on the Discord, and I'll check it before we start the discussion, the chapter title names, which I think is really fun. So for last week, we had 4 chapters, chapters 1 through 4, and those chapters were chapter 1, Scum Villain, chapter 2, what does it say? Abused Protagonist, which was Getting to Know Lo. Chapter 3, Cannon Fodder in the Way. That one's probably my favorite. And then chapter 4, Secretly Assisting the Protagonist. So very pragmatic, very, upfront names of the chapter titles. We'll see how that evolves as we go, right? And then Reiki did have a question for me to answer before we start this next section, because technically chapters 1 through 4, we got an introduction, an opening of the series. And Reiki said that according to an interview with MXTX, the Scum Villain opening is their favorite of the 3 stories, which is my favorite of the 3. And if I'm going to rank them, if I'm being very honest, I would say that this one is maybe my overall favorite starting out the MXTX line. And I'm going to explain why. My least favorite, this is such a weird thing to say because it's like comparing kiwis and dragon fruit at this point. My least favorite opening is honestly Heaven Official's Blessing. Now, I say that Heaven Official's Blessing, as of right now, is my favorite of the 3 overall, but I'll be honest, it took me a little bit of time to get into it. It took me a little bit of time to get into Heaven Official's Blessing. The opening, I was like, okay, this is fine, but it is a lot of like fantasy up front, and I was like, okay, lots of gods, goddesses, explaining all this. It took a lot up front for me to get into it, and then once we were past that initial mission, and that's all I'll say without spoiling, once we were past that initial mission, I was like, oh, I'm on board. Once we went back to like the gathering in the central location and we got a little bit of exposition and backstory and some mystery setup, I was like, oh no, I'm all on board. But the opening was fine. It was okay. It was good. I do love in Modao Zushi the opening where the very first line, it's not spoilers, the first line is Wei Wuxian is dead. Like that part just gets you. You're like, oh, that's so cool. I love that. That opening line, it sets the stage, and the idea of the gossipers and setting up like what's true, what's hearsay, and that's going to be like a fundamental thing throughout the series. Like that part's really set up really well. I would say that it's kind of comparing apples and oranges with Heaven Official's Blessing. I just like the opening line a little bit more in Modao Zushi than the opening line of Heaven Official's Blessing. But I think as a whole, the opening introduction, I like Shin's perspective, I think, the best out of the 3. Like, Shilian's great. Wei Wuxian is great. I have nothing against them as main characters. I love them. But I really love a good diva character, and Shin is a diva. He's a little peacock, and I like him. And I feel like Wei Wuxian's a gremlin. I like him a lot. Shilian is our grandpa. I like him a lot. But Shin and his dialogue and the way that it's phrased in the opening, I think this one's my favorite. Now, overall, we're going to have to finish the story before we answer that question. And that's going to be like the hardest question of the year. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But I do really like all of MXTX's openings. I think I like Scum Villain the most. I think I like in terms of first missions. Now, that's a really interesting question, though. Now we're going to get into opening versus first missions. I think in terms of openings, I like Scum Villain the best. In terms of first missions, I think I like, I guess, I don't know. Maybe I like Scum Villains the best. I don't know. That's a really hard question. Apples and oranges. I like all 3 of them. We'll just stick with opening for now. So there's that. But thank you, Reiki. I appreciate that. But yeah, so we're going to be looking at chapters 5 and 6 today. I don't know how long that will take us, but it's pages 35 through 53 in the online version and 48 through 71. So it's about 48 to 58, 58, it's about 20 something pages. It's not going to be a crazy amount. I figured this week would be the week that it's like not as much, and then next week is going to start to do 3 chapters at a time. So next week's going to be a little bit longer. So this week might just be just settling and adjusting, but I wanted to make sure and see how long these 2 chapters take us, and then we'll go from there. So if it's not a long discussion and reaction this week, that's okay. That's all right. I've already wasted 20 minutes prepping this. So, but anyway, before we start, I want to give a shout out over to our philanthropy tier over on Patreon. Y'all, we have some new patrons supporting on the philanthropy tier, and I really, really want to give them a shout out because they help support me not only in getting these novels to support MXTX and the official release, but also for being kind and supportive as well as patrons in general and those subscribing on YouTube. So thank you all so very much. But a special shout out to Alex Cornejo, to Anime Annie, to Be Happy, to Dana, to Danger Zone, to Davarin, to Danny Donmai, to Destiny Marie, to Ichu, to Eric, to Hong Yehe, to Kiri, to Elfreya, to Lyndon, to Matthew Palfinier, to Murphy, to Nameless Monster, to Nicholas, to Ninth S, to Inly 2, Sunspots, Shimoyama, Trails, and Translucent Men. Thank you all so much for your support. I greatly appreciate it. All of my love. So yeah, I'm super excited to see what's going to happen. Obviously we watched the Donghua, but even last week, the novel was a little bit different than the Donghua. So these little tweaks and changes, I'm super, super excited about. I'm going to keep this little B points thing next to me because we might need to talk about it as we go through and then use it for the discussion. So let's not waste any more time. We're going to start chapters 5 and 6 of Scum Villain's Self-Saving System. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's start. Chapter 5. In the days of Shin Qingcho's recuperation following his awakening from that inexplicable fever, Yu Qingyong came to visit him many times. So I like that right off the bat we have Shin's whole reincarnation, or rather isekaiing into this world, explained as just having a fever. Clever enough. As the sect leader of the world's foremost major cultivation sect, which might be likened to being the principal of a comprehensive cultivation university, his workload had to be heavy, yet he was still so considerate to his Shidi. As a stranger in a strange land, Shin practically wanted to shed tears of gratitude. Which, yeah, we found out last week that he initially is supposed to kill you, so of course, Shin's not going to do that now, right? Unless it happens by accident, but he's certainly not going to do it with all the arrows like he originally was supposed to. But yeah, I can't believe I thought he was so shady, and now he's just like, actually, I'm the most tender-hearted teddy bear ever. And I'm like, well, I feel like shit doing that. That the original flavor had actually turned on such a kind superior. Oh, the original flavor, I like that. And fellow disciple, that he had breached their brotherly covenant just like that. It made clear how much of a scumbag he was. Yeah, so again, the Scum Villain's self-saving system. I like that. What I also like too is that Shin's original character, despite him being handsome, is so awful. And Shin's like, yeah, he was the worst. And now Shin's trying to like make him a better person. Fun times. Now that Shidi has rested for several days, has your health improved? Yu Qingyong asked, his eyes full of earnest concern as he held one of the bamboo house's porcelain tea bowls. I have long since recovered, said Shin, lightly waving his folding fan and feeling at home in the atmosphere of brotherly love. I've caused Xingshang such trouble making him worry. Yeah, and also, he has 2 brothers, so it would make sense why he feels so brotherly there. Yep. Then I suppose it's about time for Shidi to leave the mountains, said Yu. Is there anything you need? The hand Shin was using to fan himself froze. Leave the mountains? Did the illness make you forget? Yu asked, surprised. Didn't you tell me before to leave the matter of Shanghua Hu City to you as a training opportunity for your disciples? So it was some troublesome project undertaken by the original flavor. But while Shin Qingqiu had been familiarizing himself with his body's spiritual powers and techniques, they still weren't second nature. How could he take disciples down from the mountain for training? Just as he was about to summon his resolve and embarrass himself, to renege and say his body wasn't well after all, the system's unfeeling voice reverberated in his skull. Beginner level quest issued. Location, Shanghu City. Quest, complete the training. Please click to accept. At the same time, the quest synopsis popped up before him with two options on the bottom, the left saying accept and the right saying reject. So this was a beginner level quest. Shin Qingqiu's gaze lingered on accept for a while. The option blinked green, a ding sounded, and the system said, "Quest successfully accepted. Please thoroughly read the provided files and make your preparations. We wish you a swift success." Shin Qingqiu came back to himself. "Naturally, I remember," he said while smiling. "It's just these days I've rested too much and grown slow. I had almost forgotten about this matter. I'll head out in a few days." Yu Qingshang nodded. "If you're not completely recovered, there's no need to force yourself. There's no rush to train your disciples either. You especially don't need to personally take care of this matter." Shin Qingqiu agreed, still smiling, but he couldn't help giving Yu 2 extra glances. "Zhengmin Shang, your current role, it's getting a bit too much like a quest-giving NPC." So he did say that in the Donghua. Okay, we're going to talk about this as we go, but I'm just going to keep reading and we're going to come back to this. All the fairs on Qijing Peak, whether large or small, were handed to and looked after by Shin Qingqiu's trusted subordinate, Ming Fan. Shin had discovered that in matters that didn't involve a certain protagonist, Ming Fan was surprisingly efficient and intelligent. They were able to set out the following day. Before leaving Qijing Peak, Shin briefly inspected his appearance. Teal robes, loose sash, sword at the left hip, fan in the right hand, elegant, cultured, reliable, graceful, a proper otherworldly being. In short, absolutely not OOC. Perfect. At the bottom of the long 100-step stone stairway, waiting by the mountain gates, was the carriage prepared for Shin Qingqiu, as well as a collection of horses for his accompanying disciples. "Are you kidding?" Shin muttered in his head. "In the end, this is still a cultivation setting. Why aren't we flying on swords?" "Even in a magical setting like Harry Potter, not every wizard goes out riding brooms," the system coolly replied. "It would be too conspicuous." "You sure are knowledgeable," Shin muttered. "Did you do business over at Harry Potter's before?" The system typed out a giant line of hovering symbols and its ellipses. In all these years of the system's operation, when Shin might have been the first person bored enough to act so familiarly with it, let alone to fuck around with it. On the other hand, he thought about it. This setup made sense. This trip down the mountains was for the sake of training, and the majority of these disciples were young and lacked experience. They hadn't even claimed their personal swords yet. According to the traditions of the Kangzhong Mountain sect, only once a disciple's cultivation reached a certain stage could they go to the Wanjian Peak, one of the 12 peaks, to pick a suitable blade. Though it was said that the person picked the sword, in truth, the sword also picked the person. If a person with subpar talent insisted on taking a top-class sword capable of condensing spiritual energy collected from the heavens and earth, it would be the equivalent of a beautiful woman marrying an ugly man or arranging fresh flowers and cow dung. As you can imagine, the sword would be entirely unwilling. Oh, okay. Lo Binghe's real golden finger. Oh, only activated when he came upon his own personal sword. The mystical Jin Mo. Oh, so the golden finger, oh my god. The golden finger is, Lo's. So, the question is, if it's capable of doing anything, is it capable of turning Shin Qingqiu into a bottom? Are we gonna use that magical golden finger to get into some crevices that would otherwise not be accessible? Are we gonna caress things with these golden fingers that are gonna activate things in certain degrees? Oh! Oh no! Anyway, I literally just spilled tea all over myself trying to be cool. I am embodying Shin right now. It is not even funny, y'all. Awesome. Shin Qingshou entered the carriage. Its appearance wasn't especially ornate, but the interior was both spacious and comfortable, and a small incense burner faintly smoldered within. Once he sat, Shin Qingshou had a sudden premonition that something wasn't quite right. He abruptly poked out his fan and raised it to lift the curtains. The second he looked outside, he felt he should have been struck blind by the sight. No wonder he thought that the silhouette hurrying back and forth around the carriage seemed familiar. The person everyone was ordering around to do miscellaneous tasks was none other than the great male lead, Lo Binghe. Just then, Lo hauled the last item onto the carriage, a white jade chessboard that was mandatory luggage on all of Shin Qingshou's trips, though it usually went unused. And he raised his head to see Shin observing him with a complicated expression and jolted slightly. Respectively, he said, Shizun. The injuries Lo had received from Shin Qingshou's pre-fever discipline were just about healed. The bruises on his face had vanished, and one could finally clearly see what he looked like. Even though he was young, his features still soft and immature, no degree of youth could conceal the handsome grace within him. All right, Shin, keep describing for us. Come on. On top of that, he walked around and moved with a shining air. Who would ever guess that this was Qingjing's Peak's most miserable flower bud, which had been ravaged by wind and rain for many years? Although Lo was doing the rough work of moving luggage and equipment, his attitude was meticulous. It was hard not to be moved by that earnest and focused bearing. It was especially hard for Shin, who had already found some fondness for this male lead. He was, indeed, very fond of this ruthlessly decisive protagonist, who was so clear-cut with who deserved his kindness and who his hatred. After staring for a moment, Shin made an "oh" sound and pulled back his fan, dropping the curtains. It had to be said! The male lead was inescapably the male lead. Even with how downtrodden this kid was, with no history, no prospects, no parents to love him, it was no wonder that there were still so many first, second, third, fourth female leads ready to hang off his every word, trail in his wake, and otherwise throw themselves at him. Good looks were the true way of the world. This also explained why there was always some cannon fodder or another who found him an eyesore and who wanted to vent by beating him until his head looked like a pig's. Then something else occurred to Shin. That's not right. If the total number of traveling disciples, including Lo Binghe, was 10, and there were only 9 horses, well, then weren't they missing one? All right. Even if he'd thought with his toes, he'd have known who to blame. As expected, Ming Fan's gleeful voice cut through the snickering outside. Actually, we're short on horses, so we have no choice but to inconvenience Shitty this time. Although since Shitty's foundation is poor, it's perfect. You can also take on this chance to train. Short on horses, my ass. In recent years, all the major sects, Kangjian Mountain sect, had become number 1 when it came to cultivation. It had no real business rivals. That it was overflowing with wealth could be left unsaid. In short, like they'd want for even a single horse. What? Ming Fan paused, truly well versed in digging his own cannon fodder grave. What sort of expression is that? You dissatisfied? I wouldn't dare, said Lo Binghe evenly, neither haughty nor humble. At this point, I like that neither haughty nor humble. It's fitting. At this point, a young girl's bell-like laugh cut through the air. Ning Ying Ying, we're just going to call her Ning because Ning Ying Ying is ridiculous. Shizhong, what are you two talking about? Shin held his forehead. Really, young lady, your timing. Ning was a powerful catalyst in the continued worsening of Ming Fan and Luo Binghe's relationship. Whenever she appeared, Lo was in for no shortage of suffering, and Ming Fan was in for an equal amount of personal grave digging. Once again, Shin tentatively lifted the carriage curtains a little, dithering over whether he should speak. As expected, he beheld Ning excitedly waving her hand. Ah, Lo, not enough horses? Come ride with me. She really does bring a lot of hatred down on Lo Binghe. So it is known. Although this type of plot, wherein the downtrodden protagonist receives special attention from a beauty, is a satisfying trope, often seen on Zongjian literature, it is also the likeliest to incite the envy of others and subsequent persecution. In this moment, if Lo accepted Ning's suggestion, He could forget about getting any peace on this trip. Shin could no longer sit by and bear it. Ying Ying, don't make a fuss. Men and women mustn't be too intimate. No matter how close you are with your Sheedy, there ought to be limits. Ming Fan, we're dawdling. Why haven't we set out yet? Ming Fan was overjoyed, no doubt thinking Shizu and I are on the same page, and he hastily urged the group to depart. Ning Ying Ying pouted, but said nothing. That little skit over for now. Oh, we're going to talk about this, but he just changed the plot. Shin Qingshou let his mind wander from it and returned to silently reading the files spread out on his system desk. This trip wasn't to commemorate the first plot line to take him down the mountain. It was, most importantly, concerned with a beginner-level quest that would determine whether he could unfreeze the OOC function. Shin couldn't afford to treat it with anything but the utmost seriousness. The file described the location, a small city several 10 kilometers away from Kangjiang Mountain Sect. Recently, a number of murders had occurred within it. Already, 9 people were dead. Every victim shared a common fate. The skin on their body had been meticulously peeled off from head to toe with perfect precision, as if the skin had never been attached to the deceased body at all. It was enough to horrify anyone. Therefore, the murderer had become known as the Skinner Demon. Just the sound of it makes it a lot more threatening than it was in the Donghua, I'm just saying. The Skinner Demon's chosen victims were all young, beautiful women. Therefore, in Xionghu City, every family with daughters, wives, or concubines shut and locked their doors the moment night fell. Despite this, they had been unable to stop the Skinner Demon from coming and going as it pleased. A succession of 9 horrible deaths. Yet the officials had no idea what to do. The city's people were in a state of panic. There were even rumors that it was the work of a ghost. Otherwise, how could the culprit come and go without a trace? Several influential families had met together and at last decided to send someone to Kangjiang Mountain Sect to plead for assistance from the immortal cultivators. Shin had already read this information multiple times, but no matter how many times he read it, it wasn't the least bit helpful. The hell is a Skinner Demon? I never heard of it. Is this a newly added plotline or a hidden one? Is it dangerous? Is it strong? Am I even going to be able to deal with it? Well, this isn't what we agreed to. Oh! In response to these questions, the system said, "What isn't? You were once a novel reader. Novels are a type of artistic creation, and in any artistic creation, there are always decisions that must be made and things that must be left out. Now that you've become part of this world, you naturally have to experience everything yourself, regardless of importance. You must follow every plot line to the end, and even ones omitted from the original work." So he doesn't know about this plot line. Oh! Okay, we're going to talk about that whole accept and reject thing in the discussion, but Shin Qingshou had no say in any of it. As such, he had diligently trained for numerous days, single-mindedly seeking to make his abilities second nature, lest he croak at the hands of some no-name monster before he even had the chance to die beneath the male lead's feet. Like a general passing away before his first victory. Lo was still outside, so at no moment did Shin dare to relax his vigil, keeping an eye out for any untoward activity. At the same time, he rummaged through the carriage interior. Every comfort one could imagine was on hand. Shin managed to dredge up 5 or 6 different tea sets, and he was speechless at the sight of them. No matter that in his past life he could have counted as a wealthy second generation, he still hadn't had this pointlessly indulgent in his pursuit. He hadn't been this pointlessly indulgent in his pursuit of first world affluenza, okay? At this time, a wave of cackles rolled from outside the carriage. He swept a glance outside. Lo trailed at the back of the group, at times walking, at times running. From time to time, horses encircled him, purposely kicking up a cloud of dust until he was filthy and caked with it. Shin couldn't help but clutch his fan, the handle of his fan's knuckles itching faintly. This was only a book, and all the people were constructs, imaginary characters. Logically, Shin was very clear on this fact, but when a character was actually being taunted and bullied right before his eyes, it was just flat out unrealistic to expect him to be completely unmoved. Again, we're going to talk about this, but the concept of reality versus fiction. Having attempted to dissuade them several times to no avail, Ning finally realized her interference only made things worse. She anxiously urged her horse towards the carriage and called out, "Oh, Shizun! The Shizhong, look at them!" "What about them?" Shin asked placidly. Though his heart was moved, he didn't show it. "Well, they're bullying someone so viciously, and yet you're not telling them off," she said defiantly, her voice carrying with the strength of her indignation. "If they keep on like this, Shizun, what are you teaching your disciples to become?" Even though she was directly tattling on them, Ming Fan and his lackeys didn't feel any pressure at all. They were all used to the prior Shin Qingqiu silently permitting these actions. The harsher their bullying of Lo Binghe, the happier they made their teacher. Why would they exercise restraint? Ming Fan was happiest of all. He was so sure that on the day at the back of the mountain, Lo Binghe had used some manner of sorcery he'd learned from who knew where. Today, Shizun was here and he'd be crushed. Shin Qingqiu made an "oh" sound. Then he spoke a single line. "Lo Binghe, come here." Lo Binghe's expression went blank. Accustomed to this call, he gave his quiet assent and walked over. At first, everyone was still riding high on the Schadenfreude, thinking that Shin Qingqiu was calling Lo Binghe over to grab him by the ear and discipline him. What happened next shattered their entire worldview. Shin Qingqiu used his fan to lift the curtains, and then jerked his chin at Lo Binghe before shooting a glance at the carriage interior. Even though he didn't speak, the meaning couldn't have been clearer. "Oh, Lo, hurry and get on," Ning said happily. "Shizun is letting you ride with him." Like thunder on a clear day. If they hadn't known their master so well and for so long, Ming Fan and his fellows would have suspected that Shin had been possessed by a demon. Lo also froze in astonishment, but his reaction was nevertheless swift. He paused only for a second before saying, "Many thanks to Shizun." Then he stepped into the carriage, ever conscientious, and sat straight backed in a corner. His hands and feet remained tucked in like he was afraid that his patched clothes would dirty the interior. "Warning! Warning rejected," said Shin. I wasn't out of character. Shin Qingqiu would never do anything to alleviate Lo Binghe's trouble. Verdict, OOC level 100%. "Have you carefully examined the character's complicated inner world?" Shin countered. Of course he would never do anything purely to alleviate Lo Binghe's trouble, but right now, my goal is to prevent Ning Yingying from losing faith in me as her teacher. Yingying is my dearest little disciple, and she begged me. How could I let her plea go unheard? So my actions are completely in line with Shin Qingqiu's internal logic, he declared. Your warning is invalid. During their exchanges over the last couple of days, Shin had gradually figured out a handful of the system's quirks. It had rules, but these rules were not rigid. As that was the case, there was a bit of leeway when bargaining. As he hoped, for the time being, the system couldn't think of an argument to enforce its deduction. Riding high on the delight of victory in the first battle, Shin couldn't help but laugh. However, Shin Qingqiu had in that moment been quietly sitting in the carriage, seemingly meditating with his eyes closed in a trance. When Lo suddenly heard him laugh, he couldn't resist stealing a glance at him. To tell the truth, it would have been a lie to say that Lo Binghe wasn't surprised. Even though he'd always revered Shin Qingqiu, he had no illusions about how his master treated and looked at him. At first, At first he thought that if Shin Qingqiu asked him to get in the carriage, there must be something even more terrible waiting for him within, and he mentally prepared himself for it. He hadn't expected Shin to not bother with him at all, instead focusing only on himself as he began to meditate. Lo Binghe thought for a moment. It seemed to him that he'd never been this close to his teacher before, and he never had the opportunity to carefully examine Shin Qingqiu like this. I love we're getting both their perspectives in the same chapter. Appearance-wise, you couldn't complain about him. Perhaps Shin Qingqiu couldn't qualify as supremely beautiful, but he was certainly good-looking, and you wouldn't tire of looking at him. The profile of his face, in three-quarter view, seemed to have been carved by creeks and mountain springs, and when not fixed in a cold scowl, it became gentle and bright. As soon as Shin opened his eyes, he found Lo staring at him. He saw a glimpse of the future Lo's unique grace, that of eyes like cold stars, a soft and radiant smile, with muted words and quiet laughter. Lo Binghe had been caught red-handed, and right as he was struck, lost as to what to do, Shin Qingqiu smiled at him. The smile was purely unconscious, but Lo Binghe felt like he'd been pricked by a small, fine thorn. He quickly averted his gaze and became increasingly awkward, unsure of what he was feeling. Very soon, Shin Qingqiu couldn't bring himself to smile anymore. The system had delivered a notification. Violation OOC, B points -5, current B points 165. Saith Shin Qingqiu, even a brief smile warrants a deduction? Saith the system most righteously. out of character is out of character. Oh, bitch, saith the system. I'm here for this. All right. So, saith the system. So that was the first part, Scum, the first chunk, I'm assuming, of the novel. Oh my gosh, saith the system out of character is out of character. Oh, but what is in character? Am I right? Am I right? Oh my god. All right, we're going to do chapter 6 before we go back and talk about this. Okay. Oh, we're going to go back like thunder on a clear day. Oh, yeah, I love it. Okay. Chapter 2, mission. Chapter 6. Well, part 2, chapter 6. Having learned his lesson, Shin Qingqiu spent the rest of the trip stone-faced until they arrived at Shanghu City without an incident. Although the city wasn't large, it was reasonably bustling. After gaining entry, they took up residence at the mansion of Old Master Chen, the city's richest man. He was also the only one who'd facilitated sending someone to Kangzhong Mountain Sect to plead for assistance. 2 of the Old Master Chen's beloved concubines had died horribly at the Skinner demon's hands, so he'd been desperately looking forward to Shin Qingqiu's arrival. He rubbed his beautiful third concubine's small, white, jade-like hands as he moaned and groaned to their whole party, eyes overflowing with tears. "Oh, immortal masters, you must help us. Nowadays I dare not let Daer leave my side for a second, for fear the moment she's careless, she'll be killed by that wretched monster." At these NPC-like lines, a powerful sense of déjà vu made Shin's face twitch. He very much did not enjoy the sight of a 60-year-old coot and a young girl in their teens cooing at each other right in front of him. Luckily, Shin retained the divined air of a lofty master. After this perfunctory meeting, he aloofly took his leave to his room, leaving Ming Fan to make small talk with the Old Master Chen. Certain privileges came with simply being a master. No matter how aloof you were, no one dared to say anything. In fact, the more aloof, the more respectful the gazes that trailed after you. Soon, Ning Yingying knocked and entered. "Oh, Shizun, Yingying wants to go and walk around the market," she said sweetly. "Would Shizun like to keep me company?" Speaking truthfully, no man could dislike being so prettily cajoled by a young girl. When she entered, Shin had his back facing her, but upon hearing her plea, his heart half melted. He steeled the remaining half and glanced back with the air of one looking up from a book, the essence of a cold and detached intellectual, and said blandly, "If Yingying wants to go and walk around, she may ask several Xizhong or Shi to accompany her. This master still has things to do before confronting the Skinner demon." Who else would she ask to keep her company? How could Shin Qingqiu not know? At the same time, how could he not want to go out and play? Up until now, he'd been hunkered down inside Jingying's peak bamboo house, forced to fake being an awesome master of arts and literature, meaning everything he did had to be done blandly speaking, blandly laughing, blandly practicing the sword, blandly being a poser. Bland to the point that he often had the urge to scatter a handful of salt over his head. What a damn pain. Handful of salt over his head. And now, when he finally got a break to take a trip down the mountain, he was still trapped in his room because of the system's stance that the original Shin Qingqiu liked quiet and would be unwilling to mingle. Shin didn't even want to pretend to meditate, so he lay on the bed just pretending to be dead. Shortly before sunset, Ming Fan entered the room to deliver a report. Finally, someone had come he could talk to keep him company. Shin Qingqiu couldn't help but want to weep for joy. Every perk belonged to the male lead. Every loneliness to the cannon fodder. Oh, wow! We're going to talk about that. That's a great line. Accompanying young girls to view colored lanterns and such, none of that was for their lot. "This disciple has closely examined the corpse," said Ming Fan. With a solemn expression, he presented the items in his hands. Shin took a closer look. They were 2 stacks of yellow talismans written upon with cinnabar ink. The paper had blackened to a shade akin to necrosis. "Use these talismans to assess the corpses for demonic energy?" he asked. Shizun's eyes see all. This disciple used these talismans in 2 locations. The first at the soil near the grave of a victim who'd been buried. The second beside a yet unburied corpse still at the coroner's. Even if even the grave soil was this saturated with demonic energy, then that confirmed that the Skinner demon was undoubtedly of the demon race. Finally, Shin knew what they faced. He cleared his throat, which made his following humph sound even colder. They dare to harm the normal lives of people within 100 kilometers of Kangzhong Mountain? Since these demonic lowlifes came to our door, they can't blame our disciples for enacting justice on behalf of the heavens. Listen, he really didn't want to say this corny line so full of hot air, but he'd had been OOC if he hadn't done it. Ming Fan gazed at him reverentially. Oh, Shizun is wise. If Shizun took action, that demon would be taken care of in one strike, ridding the people of evil. Shin could say nothing. It seemed this master-disciple duo was right in the mold of you reign, I'll worship, a most joyous union. To tell the truth, Shin was extremely satisfied with Ming Fan as a disciple. Even though he was a rich young master and spoiled rotten, he was never even a little arrogant in front of his teacher. Instead, he was absolutely obedient and incredibly respectful. A man could never dislike being worshipped like a god. You would be surprised when it comes to having official's blessing, but okay. Ming Fan had also single-handedly handled the travel preparations, from arrangements to lodge to food to lodging. If his IQ hadn't inevitably plummeted whenever he laid eyes on the protagonist, transforming him into a schoolyard bully capable of any misdeed, he would also be a promising young sprout. And moreover, as a fellow victim, Shin always felt a kind of pity for this cannon fodder disciple who, in the end, Lo would throw into an ant pit, so he'd be bitten to death by tens of thousands of ants. Well, okay, chopping off limbs, putting people in ant pits. Yeah, we're going to talk about this. We get to the discussion. Oh no. This trip down from the mountains is for the sake of your training. Unless, as a last resort, this master will not assist you. Ming Fan, as the most senior disciple, you must design careful strategies lest you let that demon harm your fellow disciples. Yes, this disciple's already devised a tactical formation. As long as that demon, before Ming Fan could finish, a person rushed into the room, interrupting him. Oh, Shizun! Lo's face was stark white as he yelled. Shin Qingqiu's heart thumped once, but he feigned indifference. Oh, what has happened to make you shout so loudly and in such a panic? Ning, Yinging Shiji, she went with me to the city's market earlier today. Once evening fell, I urged Shiji to return, but she refused. Then somehow she suddenly vanished. This disciple searched the entire street once but couldn't find her, and he only came back to plead with Shizun for help. If Ning Yingying had disappeared at this crucial moment, this was no joke. Night had almost fallen. Oh, so that whole scene when they're walking in the market in the Donghua, that's just Donghua only? That's not in the novel? We're going to talk about the Donghua versus this, but so that was all Donghua only. Okay. All right. Ming Fan leapt up right away. It was Lo Binghe! You! Shin promptly flicked his sleeves, and the tea bowl on the desk exploded. As a deterrent, it wasn't out of character, and more importantly, it prevented Ming Fan from further digging his own grave. Oh, he's caring about Ming Fan so much and wants to keep him from getting killed. Look at him. Shin assumed an expression of barely suppressed anger. If it's already come to this, there's nothing more to say. Lo Binghe, come with me. Ming Fan, take a couple of shidi and ask Lord Chen for assistance. Then go look for your shime. Ming Fan sent a hateful look at Lo, but nodded and hurriedly left. Lo Binghe remained, his head lowered, not saying a single word. Shin Qingqiu knew this absolutely wasn't Lo's fault. Ning Yingying's role as a female character wasn't just to be lovable and cute, but also to dig her own grave and be a burden. In the original work, a number of plot twists caused by her sudden disappearances, blunders, and other messes had allowed airplane shooting towards the sky to drag out the plot for hundreds of chapters. Oh my god! At times, Shin Qingqiu had been rather impressed with Lo's fortitude when it came to accepting harem members. He never refused anyone, daring to accept even the most troublesome of women, and he did this without being screwed over or killed. Shin could only say that, as expected, the brilliant protagonist truly was overwhelmingly cool, awesome, insane, and badass. With a dick longer than the heavens. A normal person definitely could not have put up with such things. I'm just saying, y'all, the bottom Shin agenda is growing. Shit! Lo Binghe, who thought Shin had ordered him to stay so as to beat and yell at him, said quietly, "This entire affair is this disciple's fault. If Shizun wishes to punish this disciple, he will neither resent nor regret it. He only wishes for Ning Shiji's safe return. He looked incredibly pitiful. Shin wanted to pat his head, but as the system's existence obstructed this, he forcibly held himself back. Come, he said coldly. I don't think he's going to be the one doing that. Take me to the place where your Shiji vanished. Lo and Ning Yingi had lost each other at the most bustling corner of the market. Shin closed his eyes and he sensed a barely perceptible thread of demonic energy. He followed that thread, which seemed like it would at any moment fray or snap, until he opened his eyes again and found that he stood at the doors of the cosmetics shop. Shin stared at it silently. Could it be the murderer worked here? Would it be that easy? However, upon entering the cosmetics shop, the thread of demonic energy snapped, dissipating completely. Perhaps the murderer wasn't hiding in the shop and had just come to this point at some point recently. If they'd patronized a cosmetics shop, was the Skinner demon a woman? Shin made these stabs in the dark, and he sent Lo inside to ask a few questions, but this yielded no results. This quest had been offered to him expressly so he could level up. Thus, none of its scenes had been in the original work, so he had no point of reference. Shin further acknowledged that he wasn't a master of deduction capable of deep analytical thought, who could infer a multitude of facts from a single clue. When playing room escape or detective games, he'd always run into dead ends. Oh, well, that's a good thing to note. That's a good thing to note about his character. As he was agonizing, well, that makes a lot of sense of him being oblivious. As he was agonizing, the system thoughtfully notified him. We noticed that you have encountered difficulties. Would you like to spend 100 B points to activate easy mode? Well, shit, if there was something like easy mode, you could have said so sooner, Shin snapped. Activate, activate, activate. He fixed his gaze on the yes option for 3 seconds. That's the ticket. The option blinked green and disappeared. Then something in the air sent goosebumps all down his back. Such palpable demonic energy, as if they were afraid that otherwise no one would find the target. Calling this easy mode was no lie. Shin Qingqiu wasn't the least bit ashamed about using the easy mode, and with spirits soaring, he strode in the direction from which the demonic energy emanated. A mere 500 steps later, they had left the central district and arrived in front of an abandoned, neglected house. This has to be the place. Just look at those ghastly white paper lanterns. Look at those dilapidated gates. A proper haunted house, don't you see? So this is a little bit different, right? Shin Qingqiu schooled his expression and turned to Lo, who had been silently following behind him. Return to Qin Manor and notify Ming Fan to bring all the disciples and the talismans here. Lo had yet to speak when his pupils suddenly contracted. He was staring straight at something behind Shin. That didn't bode well. However, it was too late, and in the end, a gust of foul wind blew past, slamming the gates open. Oh, we don't get the hand reaching the Donghua. Oh, man. Okay. Okay. Shizun, wake up quickly. Shin Qingqiu woke up. Upon opening his eyes, he saw Lo opposite him, looking awfully distressed, his arms and torso bound. As Shin roused himself, Lo heaved a heavy sigh of relief, his eyes brightening. Oh, Shizun! Shizun, Ning Ying echoed. She was tied up with Lo, her expression miserable. Shin was a little dizzy, and he had no idea if whatever crap the demon had sprayed on him had any side effects. He was in a foul mood. This easy mode was straightforward to the point of mercilessness. It had delivered him straight into the boss's mouth. The worst part was that the dignified Peak Lord of Jingying Peak had been unexpectedly struck down by a mini-boss, and thus, shortly after he woke up, the system shrilly declared, out of character, B points minus 50. He just spent 100 B points to activate the easy mode, and now in a flash he lost another 50. How could he not be distressed? The original Shin Qingqiu's skill at facing down the demon should have made this quest as easy as killing a chicken with a knife. Shamefully, the knife had failed to even hit the chicken. In seconds, Shin discovered something that made his move even worse. His body felt a little strange. He was chilly, and he had a slight ache all over. Upon lowering his head, he almost couldn't stop a fuck leaving from his mouth. He'd been stripped naked. Yeah! All right. All right. Oh my God. Well, we have quite a bit to talk about. Like thunder on a clear day. And the game was changed. From that moment on, the game was changed, and that's all it took. I that's probably my favorite line so far. That line is probably my favorite in the book so far, like thunder on a clear day, of him letting him in the carriage. That, and then the very end of chapter 5, when it's like, oh, so even a smile warrants a deduction, saith Shin Ching Cho, saith the system, out of character is out of character. And I was like, that's such a great ending to that chapter. Oh, that's so good. When I started reading the chapters, I was stopping and starting every 5 seconds, and I'm like, no, Romania, you got to get through this, and then we'll go back and do it in the discussions. So yeah, let's talk about these chapters. I want to say first and foremost, I feel like I just pulled an Untamed cliffhanger, a Donghua from Scum Villain cliffhanger, because I know that chapter 6 ended like in the middle of a scene. So next week we're going to be looking at chapters 7 through 9. So hopefully it will be a little bit more like a bigger chunk to go through. But I had already put down that I was going to do chapter 5 and 6 tonight. And I know that if I start reading beyond what I've set down for myself, I'll keep reading and I won't be able to stop. So I'll probably wait till I get comments from the first part and before I record the next part. But let's talk about this. So I really like the way the story is written a lot different than the other 2 MXTX stories. I feel like this feels more raw. Does anybody else get that feeling? This feels like the first novel from an author. It feels more raw, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but it doesn't feel like as refined. I feel like MXTX, when they were doing Modao Zushi, you can start to see the transition in their storytelling from this to Modao Zushi. And then by the time they get to Heaven Official's Blessing, it's polished. It's kind of more refined. It's polished, their storytelling, their narrating. This feels more raw, but I like it. It's kind of like rough around the edges, and I appreciate that. So the only image we get from this chapter set is a pretty darn good one. And that is the infamous scene. The scene that is the catalyst of all scenes of Lo in there with Shin in the carriage. Oh, can I just say, before we even start this, the Donghua has made the shipping elements between Lo and Shin, like, amped up by 1,000. Because there's moments in the Donghua that I'm like, oh, that's way more shippy than in the novel. Interesting. It's like I kind of get the same feeling from, well, no, Heaven Official's Blessing is just as flirty in the book. So I feel like with this, they were like, yeah, we're going to amp it up a little bit, which makes this very interesting because I can kind of see why Shin would be a little bit more oblivious in this version, because, you know, it's not as apparent when we're seeing it through Shin's eyes just how much Lo likes him. But one thing I do appreciate with this novel is that it's giving us Lo's perspective and giving us inside of his head. So you can, because they have to do that. Otherwise, I don't think Shin would notice right off the bat how the story is changing and how Lo is getting attached to him. I think if we didn't have Lo's perspective put in the story, it would not be as obvious to us as well, right? Because in Heaven Official's Blessing, it's its own story, and I'm not going to spoil that for you. But I would say, comparing to like Modao Zushi, in Modao Zushi, I feel like Shin is a little bit closer to Wei Wuxian than he is to Shi Lian. And in Modao Zushi, Wei Wuxian kind of has the same thing going on that Shin does, where we, the audience, are like, oh, you're into Lo. Do you not get it? And in Modao Zushi, Wei Wuxian kind of gets it, but he's also kind of in denial. He's like, he's our bisexual king. And there is an element of Shin that kind of wants me to think that he's a little bisexual, because he does talk about how in the throne room, he's like, yeah, well, I mean, what guy would not lift up his head when a girl walked into the room and offer her assistance? So there is a little bit of that kind of, with Lo, we don't get at this point any noticeable interest in a female character, which is interesting because at this point, you know, Shin's gone on about how Lo has a damn harem of like hundreds of women. So he's, you know, but we've not got any indication that that's the case. There is a little part that I want to talk about when we get to it, but we're going to get to it. But yeah. So I've put up here the B points. I feel like we need to have a B point counter as we go, because something I noticed, I went back to the end of chapter 4. The last thing we get from the system is they say that once he did the fake jade icon, for changing the storyline, Shin gets 100 points. So because he got the Jade icon, he now had 130 B points. Please continue to work hard. But the next time we get a notification about B points is when there were 5 taken away for the smile, which we might as well go back to this one. So then he had -5 for the out of character smile, which at the end of chapter 5 left him with 165 points at the end of chapter 5. So basically that means that between the events of chapters 4 and chapters 5, when that happened, he had somehow at some point gained 40 extra B points. Somehow. Which we have established that time is passing in this novel, so it's going to be interesting to see how his B points accrue and change over the course of the story, and to keep track of that. So that's what we're going to kind of keep the B point counter up here for whenever we need it, right? We'll just keep that, we'll keep that aboard. But yeah, so I like I said at the beginning, I like that they frame his fever as, we'll just put this over here, kind of the events that are changing, and my poor marker is facing the end of days. So we're going to switch back over this one. So let's go with events that have kind of lined out here. So we have post fever, right? Which if you think about it, that's a pretty clever way for Shin to kind of like talk about how he's changed. He's like, oh, well, it was the fever that changed me. I'm wondering if at some point when we get him in the story, he's gonna be like, why have you changed? And Shin's like, it was just a fever, I don't know. And Liu's gonna be like, it fried your brain cells. So when the fever broke, your brain cells broke with it. And Shin's gonna be like, I don't know. So I think that definitely could be a possibility of an explanation, but I like that. So that's creating something that's a little bit different. I also like that Yu is basically likened to a like headmaster, like Dumbledore. If we're going to talk about Harry Potter, he's like the Dumbledore of the sect, and Shin should be the Snape, but he ends up being Sirius, kind of, I guess. It's interesting that Shin, I like the idea. Here's the thing about Shin's character. He's really kind, and he's super like kind-hearted. That's kind of, I think, what gravitates me towards Shin so much, is that he is a kind soul, like Wei Wuxian and like Shi Lian. He's a kind person under the surface. The thing about it is, he doesn't come across that way because he's a diva peacock. And he's trying to pass as this scum villain, so he can't quite present it, but everything he does, from feeling, grateful to you, to trying to help Ming Fong not die. I think that is, the book makes that part also clear, that Shin connects with Ming Fong, and he's like, man, I feel you, dude. I know what you're going to be. I know what you're going to be suffering from. And I don't want you to suffer that same fate, just like I don't want to suffer a bad fate. So let's try to make the story better and change our outcomes. And I really appreciate that he has this kind heart, but because he's the narrator and he's kind of in a weird way humble about it, he doesn't want to come out and be like, I'm a kind-hearted person, but he really is. It goes back to the Donghua. Hooray for the kind person. That's literally Shin in this story, right? I also like how the OG version of Shin is called the original flavor. Like, the original flavor of Shin is actually like a total asshole. Like, I don't think the Donghua quite illustrated how bad Shin was at the beginning, but the moment where they talk about like he sees Lo, and Lo's like recovering from all of his injuries that he sustained at the hands of the original flavor Shin, that part was really hard. It's like he had bruises all over him. His face was all beat up. And then he like, you can see there is a little bit of post-traumatic stress and trauma from Lo at the hands of Shin, because when he goes to see him, he like cowers down thinking something bad's going to happen to him, like a dog that's been beaten. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. So it's way more pronounced in the novel than it is in the Donghua. The Donghua seems more about the shipping elements, which they, the Donghua crew probably knows more of the story at that point than it is of presenting it kind of the reality of, oh my God, Lo was actually terrified of Shin, and is now suddenly faced with a Shin that's super kind to him, and he's like, what the heck? So I have a feeling that that's going to have more weight when we get further into the story, not only with Liu being like, why are you being like this now? And Nightmare trying to convince Lo to become evil. I feel like that's going to have more weight later on than it does in the Donghua. But we'll see, right? So anyway, so this part is interesting. Leave the mountains. And he's like, well, did your illness make you forget? You had this quest to go to Shanghu City. The quest is complete the training. And so, yeah, let's talk about this. So, in the OG version, this is not something he knows about. The Donghua plays it out as Shin knows exactly what this training is. And he's like, oh, yeah, I've done it before. But here, we have this new mission, which is the city. And that is to unlock the out-of-character function. And I think, too, I remember back when I was watching the Donghua, I think that I had in my head that the out-of-character function was going to be this long-running plot point, because I don't think the Donghua makes it known that this is not something that was in the original novel. Because I think in the Donghua, if I'd have to go back and watch now, I think in the Donghua, he just accepts the mission and he's like, yes, of course, this is how it is in the story. And so you're thinking, okay, well, this out-of-character function is going to be something that comes along way down the road because he knows the story at this point. He's just going to have to try to, like, act it out without, trying to alter the story without, changing the details and acting out of character. But in the novel, it's established a lot more clearly that the out-of-character function needs to be unlocked very instantly in order for us to make any progress. So that, alongside the fact that this didn't even exist in the OG version, is a pretty big sign that there are drastic changes to the novel that are going to happen right before our eyes. And Shin hasn't quite acknowledged it yet, but it's very clear that this is going to happen. Also, something else too, the idea of accept or reject. This part, like, blew my mind, that you could have a choose your own adventure and you accept the mission or you reject it. That, being a function in this story, could have major impacts later on if you choose to accept or reject something. And we see it a little bit in the Donghua where Shin is like, well, do I have to go to the abyss? And they're like, yeah, you got to go to the abyss. And he's like, So that part terrifies me. Choose your own adventure stories terrify me. And I hated them growing up because I hated choose your own adventures growing up because I was like, you mean to tell me if I don't get an ending I like, I have to go all the way back to the beginning and start over and pick it again? And I'm a completionist. I realize someone in the Discord called me a compulsive completionist, and I'm like, yes, I am. Because I want to complete the story and I want to finish it. And choose your own adventure stories give me a level of anxiety because you can't just pick one and settle with it, because when you're done with that storyline, you're going to be like, but what if I picked the other option? And you're going to go back and pick the other option. And so it's like, and you literally will have to sit there and go through each and every storyline till it's finished. And I could see that in an isekai, that would be something you would strive to have, because you could have multiple endings, multiple opportunities for the characters to do different things. Makes sense, right? And so I also like the fact that if Shin stares at the accept button for 3 seconds, it will click green and accept the mission. So he's like, it's just these days I've rested, and he tries to give you an explanation for it. And I like that he kind of gets onto you for being an NPC at this point, and so he says that all of his subordinates were there, including Ming Fan. And he's like, in matters that didn't involve a certain protagonist, Ming Fan was surprisingly efficient and intelligent. It's almost as if, the story, the way that Another Plane in the Sky had written Ming Fan's character, is that he's almost like an NPC himself, where he's set to every time he's just around Lo, he acts ridiculous. But then when he's not around Lo, he's actually a nice person, and Ming Fan's pretty effective and a good person to be around. So I like this idea that Shin is trying to change the story to where Ming Fan isn't always that way around Lo. And there's something else that's kind of brought out that I really like that's explained. And it's this idea of bullying by association. where it's this concept, it's kind of like a mob mentality. It's this thing where because Shin has actively encouraged this bad behavior towards Lo, the other, disciples, they're all fine with it because nobody's stopping them and setting a good example. So it generates this like negative behavior that's reinforced by OG Shin, and they don't see a problem with it. And you can see how in the original story it would have kept escalating to the point where Lo reaches a breaking point and just snaps. Whereas in this, by Shin taking that first step, thunder on a clear day, and making the example of Lo not being bullied anymore, it's going to change the course of the story like that. And then everything's going to like ripple effect off of it. Which is so exciting, right? I love that. I think that's so freaking cool. But yeah, so Image and Harry Potter, I can't believe they got away with it in this. J.K. Rowling, probably doesn't care. But we'll see. I also like the fact that the system uses an ellipses. That's hilarious. So here's the thing. Shin says in all these years of the system's operation, Shin might have been the first person bored enough to act so familiarly with it, let alone to fuck around with it. I like the idea that Shin thinks that isekais just happen to everybody that's involved in the novel. I like that he assumes that the system has been around with multiple people. So that's interesting. That makes me kind of wonder if Shin is just one character that's in a shell of the character within the novel. What if somebody from the outside world has been isekai'd into Lo's character? What if that's the case? What if there's all these avatars that are being inhabited by other people from the outside world in this story walking around and interacting with the story as well, kind of like Shin is, and trying to alter the plot line and make it bigger and grander and whatever? Who knows? It would be kind of fun if whenever Lo gets out, if he gets out of this novel, if at the end of the story, he doesn't stay. I haven't decided yet if I think Shin is going to stay in the story with Lo, and that's going to be like he's going to live out the rest of his days in this other world, or if he's going to wake up and not have died or got resuscitated in the real world. And then he's like, oh shit, now I'm out of the novel. It would be really cool if he got out of the novel and back into the real world at the end. And then he walks outside and runs into the person that had inhabited Lo throughout the story, and they meet in real life. I don't know. That's really cliche, but I'm all about cheesy cliche endings when it comes to that sort of thing, so I'm fine with it. But we'll see what MXTX does. I have no clue how MXTX is going to take this story, so we're just barely into it. So we'll just see how that goes, right? We'll see how that goes. So it says, according to the traditions of the Kangzhong mountain sect, only once a disciple's cultivation reaches a certain stage could they go to the Zhan Peak, one of the 12 peaks, to pick a suitable blade. So we'll talk about this. It says that they're trying to train because the person who picks the sword also picks the person. So they make a point of saying that swords only gravitate towards compatible people. So a sword is not going to, a strong sword is not going to choose a weak person, basically. They're going to want to find people that are comparable. So that's good to know. So they kind of, again, are giving us the idea that these swords have personalities, kind of like the swords in Modao Zushi. We're going to see where that takes us. Not to spoil Modao Zushi. But yeah, so Liu Binghei's real golden finger only activated when he came upon his own personal sword, the mystical Jin Mo. So, okay. So, let me see here. So, his real golden finger. Okay. I don't know if the golden finger is going to be his actual golden finger, or if it's going to be, it says it doesn't activate, only activates when he came upon his own personal sword, the mystical Jin Mo. I'm like, are they talking about his sword being the golden finger? Are they talking about him actually having a golden finger? Are they talking about his dick? I can't decide which it is, and I don't I think MXTX could go with all three. I think MXTX could be like, oh, the golden finger, it's his finger. It's actually got mystical properties once he holds the sword. Or, no, the golden finger is like what his sword becomes. No, the golden finger is his penis. Like, I could see MXTX going all three directions. I could see her being completely figurative or literal. So, we're going to see what happens with his magic finger, but it's connected to Lo. And there could be dirty things involved with it. So, we'll see what ends up happening, right? So yeah, I also like the idea when we go into this carriage that that Shin, there's like a chessboard that's a white jade chessboard that's mandatory luggage, though it's usually unused. I think that ties back really great because later on in the Donghua, we see him trying to play chess against the one female cultivator, and he's like, yes, quite so. But they established in the novel right now that he doesn't normally play chess. So he's not usually a chess player, which is hilarious because he has it there to look smart, but he rarely uses it, right? So then we see poor Lo. And Lo, again, connecting a little bit to Wei Wuxian, every time Shin describes Lo, it's like he's writing poetry. It's like he's talking about how he's handsome, he's beautiful, he's the most miserable flower bud, he's been ravaged by the wind and the rain for years, but he's still blooming. I'm like, okay. And again, there is part of me that, like, describing Lo as a flower bud makes you think of it blooming open, which has kind of a feminine sexual context to it. So in that sense, I'm like, okay, well, is Lo a bottom? But everything else about these chapters makes me think, oh no, the Shin bottom agenda is real, because talking about Lo using his magic finger, okay. And then there's another moment in here where we're talking about where I was like, oh, that's a bottom agenda moment. So we'll talk about that when we get with their Shin. But there's a little part of me that is kind of like, and I've heard some people get kind of like about the pairing of them, because Shin is clearly older than Lo, and Lo is just 14 when this is all going down. So there's a part of me that's a little bit like, Shin describing him as a handsome, I'm like, he's 14, he's a kid, let's, at that part I'm a little bit about, I would rather us fast forward to when he's older, and then it's like not problematic, but it's okay. I'm just saying I was a little bit kind of irked out about it, but it's not enough to make me against them as a ship by any means. But it was just made me go, let's wait a little bit. But yeah, so I feel like Shin talking about he's very fond of this ruthlessly decisive protagonist who is clear cut in who deserved kindness and who his hatred. So yeah, let's add that onto the board here to talk a little bit about Lo. Getting here where Lo is very decisive with who gets his love and who gets his hatred. They do a really good job in this novel of subtly setting up that Lo is kind of a canon where if he doesn't like you, you're screwed. Like the idea of, I mean, we talked about Shin being like, oh shit, I killed you with 1,000 arrows. And then Liu, we know that he kills him in the cave originally in the original story, which all sounds gruesome and whatnot. But then you hear about Lo, who like fed Ming Fan to ants alive, buried him alive and let ants eat him, and then chopped off the tongue and limbs of Shin and just kept him in a pickle jar. And it's like, so it's almost like this setup of violence begets violence, and negative behavior begets negative behavior. And so a part of this story is the idea that a positive behavior can change a negative person's outlook into a positive one. And I'm just now noticing on this cover, as I'm telling you all this, that Shin is essentially putting a shade over Lo. And Lo in that picture looks like he's got the scuffs and like he's got the scuff marks on him and everything. And this is him like from the carriage. And then we have Shin shading him and offering him shade from the cruelty of the world. His kind gesture to change fate, essentially. So I also like the idea that Shin talks about cannon fodder and how he feels bad for them and how he feels bad for the cannon fodder. and how they are, because we'll talk about it a little bit later on when we get to the city, but I think that's an interesting perspective that Shin kind of feels sympathy for the extra characters. I think that's a really cool like little side note that we're going to touch upon here in a little bit. But yeah, so Shin notes there's no reason for them not to have horses. And then we talk about Ning Ying Ying as the catalyst to worsen Ming Fan and Lo Binghei's relationship. Whenever she appears, Lo is in no shortage of suffering, and Ming Fan was in an equal amount of grave digging. So in the original, old Ning Ying Ying, she is the catalyst of bullying for Shin. And the essential reason is because Ming Fan is jealous. He likes Ning, and he likes her, and he's jealous because she doesn't give him enough time of day. She'd rather be over with Shin, her like BFF. And it's like, okay, which it kind of makes sense. And I like that Shin says she really does bring a lot of hatred down on Lo. It's almost like Shin wants to keep her away from Lo to like protect him, which is fun. And he talks about the trope of her inciting envy from the others around the protagonist. And I like that Shin kind of, again, Shin is making decisions and altering the plot ever a little bit. So we have not only the carriage incident changing the plot, but we also have him kind of shooing Ning away, in a sense. Because if you think about it, in the OG novel, whenever Lo is faced with all of these horrible incidents happening to him, well, Ning is always there to provide support to him, so of course he clings to her, but it's like a big perpetuating cycle. Him clinging to her because she's the only one that's nice to him leads him to get bullied more, which leads him to cling to her more, which leads to him getting bullied more. There's no like buffer. There's no person to be in the middle of it, and now Shin's that person in the middle of it. So it makes sense that before, Lo had all of his affection go towards Ning because she was the only one that would take it. So who else could he give that to, right? But Shin talks about how this mission is just to activate an unfreezed out of character function. And so he's being very serious about it. And so we find out the way they describe the Skinner demon in the novel is pretty scary. The idea that it just meticulously scraped the skin off of its victims, which is pretty terrifying. And so there's been 9 deaths, and he's like, we need to go and figure out what it is. But I really like this idea that Shin's like, I don't know about this plot line. Is it dangerous? Is it strong? Am I going to be able to handle it? This isn't what we agreed to. And the system's like, well, you were a novel reader, so there's always decisions that have to be made and that have to be left out. So now you're a part of this world, so you have to experience everything for yourself regardless of importance. You have to follow every plot line to the end, even ones omitted from the original work. So the hidden plot lines, the deactivated plot lines, we find out that Shin, he needs to follow. So maybe it's not going to be possible for him to reject the plot assignments that are given to him. Maybe that's just like the system like gives him that option just to be cruel, and she's like, well, actually you can't do that. Otherwise we're going to take away your B points, so you have to accept no matter what. But I also like the idea that the system is making him interact with the story, because him interacting with the story is going to probably make him feel more empathetic and connected to the characters. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that, right? He had no say in it. He's like, he had trained for all this time, and now we're going to this random city. And so I like this idea that Shin, you know, he keeps looking out for Lo outside. And I also like the fact that Shin talks about how he's kind of a little bit disturbed by how indulgent the OG Shin was. Like, he has the 5 or 6 tea sets, and Shin is like, you know, I came from a pretty upper middle class. We were well off and privileged, but even to me, this is a bit extravagant. Like, I like getting these little tiny details with Shin's character. It makes him more fleshed out, and it makes us kind of relate to him more and like him more as we go, right? And I also like how he ends everything with like, okay? Like, that's like, do you get it? Okay? Like, I didn't know what this was gonna be like, okay? Like, that's his like, right? So, in any case, he says he sees Lo getting beat up, and he sees Lo getting left out. And I love this part where it says, it's only a book. These people are constructs. They're imaginary characters. But when a character was actually being taunted and bullied before his eyes, it was unrealistic to expect him to be completely unmoved. And I love that because I think that we've talked about in several series that I've watched on this channel how you can kind of suspend, you know, yourself from the characters in the story because you know it's fictional, you know it's not real. But when you do see stuff that's happening in a series that you watch in the real world, it suddenly takes on a much more important context. And if you've experienced things that the characters experience in the fiction that you watch and read, you definitely have a bigger connection to them. You feel more empathetic to their cause. You feel more connected to their story. And I like the idea of Shin talking about how when he sees this bullying going on in real life, he feels moved to act. And I'm like, that's such a big thing for his character, right? That means something huge for his character. And I love that. So he finally, you know, he's like, I like that Ying Ying tries to get him to do something. And he says, Lo, Binghe, come here. And they're like, Shizun's letting you ride with him like thunder on a clear day. And I love how the system says warning with the dots though. It's almost like the system, again, I talked about it in the Donghua, the system is trying to help Shin unlock the hidden storyline. And it almost with that ellipses, it's like the system saying, do you have a way to get around this? You seem like you know what you're doing. What are we doing? And then that's when he explains that her warning is invalid because of X, Y, and Z. And the system's like, fine, you've answered the question, you solved the mystery. So then we get to this carriage scene. The Donghua makes that carriage scene so damn homoerotic. It's amazing. Here, it is a big moment. It's a huge moment, but it is a lot more subtle in the novel than the Donghua makes it seem, right? And so Shin is trying to meditate and look like he's trying to pass off that nothing's going on. Now, in the Donghua, he gives him medicine, right? He gives him medicine and says, well, I can't have my disciples, you know, looking, you know, worse for wear. And it seems like in the novel, he even has, like, the medicine, but in the actual novel scene, he doesn't give him any. So I don't know if this novel was put out after the Donghua season and the illustrations were done after the Donghua, and so the medicine pot is just there like it is here. But there is no medicine pot in the story. So I'm like, it's just an add-on, which is interesting. But yeah. And then I like that we get Lo and his perspective for a moment. We actually get inside Lo's head to see what he's seeing. And I like that he kind of like, it's not a backhanded compliment, but he's like, oh, well, he's not supremely beautiful, but he's certainly good looking and you wouldn't tire of looking at him. Like, I wouldn't kick him out of the bed for eating crackers, am I right? And plus, I like that it's the description from a teenager's perspective of being like, it looked like it was carved by mountains and creeks. When not fixed into cold scow, it became gentle and bright. So I kind of like how when Shin is describing Lo, he's like praising him and like making him like a young Adonis. And then whenever Lo is describing Shin, he's like, he's not bad looking. I'm going to be curious to see if we get inside of Lo's head as we go and how that viewpoint develops. That part's going to be really interesting, right? And he says, as Shin opened his eyes, Lo was staring at him. He saw a glimpse of the future Lo Bing's unique grace, that of eyes like cold stars, a soft and radiant smile with muted words and quiet laughter. And then Lo smiled at him. It was unconscious, but he felt like he'd been pricked by a small, fine thorn. It's like that first little twinge of something there, right? Like a pinprick. Mm-hmm. So then, yeah, that's when the system says 5 B points are deductive and you're down to 165. And I love that line, saith Shin Chingcho, even a brief smile warrants a deduction. Saith the system most righteously, out of character is out of character. It's dawning on me, too, this whole OOC thing, that this entire novel, and maybe this whole series, is a test of what is out of character. What is the character of Shin Yan? because we don't know a lot about Shinyon. We know that he's taking a hold of this shell and he's trying to alter Shin's perception of himself towards himself and others, specifically Lo, so that he doesn't end up dying. But the big question is this transition from the Scum villain to Shin Chingcho as he should be, according to Shinyon, is it going to reveal Shinyon's actual character? Is this story going to be Shinyon's sexual awakening and him realizing his homosexuality? Who knows? We're going to find out, though, which is going to be a lot of fun. But, so then we get to chapter 6, where the mission starts. And I am sorry that it ends on that whole naked line. I almost wish I would go ahead and read chapter 7, but I have 7 through 9 for next week, so we're going to do that. It'll be fine. But we have, having learned his lesson, he spent the rest of the trip stone-faced. There's some dialogue in the Dongwall that is said out loud to just kind of explain things that are told to us through the narration of the novel, which is fine. I'm glad we don't have to see much of the old Master Chin's like make-out session. The irony is that Shin talks about how he doesn't enjoy the sight of a 60-year-old cute and a young girl in her teens cooing right in front of him, when we don't really know how old Shin is, but it's established he's a lot older than Lo. So there's a little irony there, but it's fine. It's fine. So then we have the idea of Ning wanting to go to the market. And honestly, at first, it seemed like Shin wanted to go with her just to get out of there. But in the Dongwall, the system's like, no, you can't go. That'd be out of character. But I love how the novel explains that Shin is just so tired of being forced to be somebody he's not in the role of Shin Chingcho. Like he talks about, he's like, I've been doing everything blandly to be in character. Blandly speaking, blandly laughing, blandly practicing the sword. I love the line where he says, to the point where he was urged to scatter a handful of salt over his head. He was so bland. But yeah, it makes so much sense where he's like, I need this out of character thing to get out of here so I can be myself. Which is going to be so fascinating because we talk about him being himself when he's playing Shin after the out of character function is unlocked. So that's going to be interesting to see develop throughout all of this. But then he talks about Ming Fan and how he feels bad for him. And he says he didn't want to say this corny line so full of hot air, but he would have been considered out of character if he hadn't. And he says he was extremely satisfied with Ming Fan as a disciple. Even though he was a rich young master and spoiled rotten, he was never even a little arrogant in front of his teacher. I wonder if he feels kind of reminded of Ming Fan and himself. And he's like, a man could never dislike being worshipped like a god. Well, Heaven Fisher's Blessing would tell you the opposite, but I'll let you figure that out for yourself if you've not watched that series. But what I like about it is that as a fellow victim, Shin always felt a kind of pity for cannon fodder, who in the end, Lo would end up killing. So I like the idea that Shin kind of feels this empathy towards Ming Fan and is like, hey, we're kind of in the same boat. I feel for you, man. I want to help you get out of the situation just as much as you want to help me. So that's so interesting. So yeah, the whole stuff with Ning that's in the Dongwall where Lo kind of like goes back and realizes that he likes Shin, that's not in this, which is fascinating to me. That's not in this at all. So, okay. I think that's really neat. I'm going to be curious, like I said, of what inside Lo's head we're going to get. We know that we're going to get Lo's perspective when he encounters Nightmare. So that's going to be interesting. I'm super excited by that, but that's so intriguing that we didn't have that scene in the novel. And Shin is dedicated to trying to help Ming Fan not die. So yeah, in the original work, we talk about some Ning. Yeah, she wasn't just to be lovable and cute, but to dig her own grave and be a burden. So in the original version, going back to Ning here, she is constantly causing trouble. And in turn, she is inflating the plot. Yeah. So they establish in this that at times He was impressed with with Lil's fortitude when it came to accepting harem members. He never refused anyone, daring to accept even the most troublesome of women, and he did it without being screwed over or killed. So that's a really big thing to me, because the way that the Donghua made it out to be was that Lo was going around like a damn Pokemon trainer, collecting these harem girls, and like he was battling the Elite Four. That's what it came across in the Donghua. Like he'd go to each sect and be like, I'm taking your daughter. I'm taking your girl disciple that's the most powerful one. I'm doing this. Like he'd just come there, woo them, and they'd run off with him, and then they'd fawn over him, and that was the whole story. The novel, according to Shin, makes it seem like the girls came to him and he just didn't say no. That's what it makes it out to be. It's like all the girls came running to Lo, and he was just like, sure, be in my harem. Sure, be my wife. Sure, have my kids. Sure, do this. And didn't turn them down. The big difference there is that if it's the fact that he's accepting any woman that wants to be part of the harem and come in, that's a little bit of a different vibe than him going around and choosing those women, right? To me, what that sounds like is that you could easily have Lo, who doesn't actually want to be with any of those women, but you know, he never had anybody love him or show him kindness outside of these women, so all he knows is to accept them into the harem because they're the only ones that show him compassion. So the fact that Shin comes in and shows him compassion and is the first like person to genuinely give it to him, figuratively and possibly literally later on, would mean that he wouldn't have to say yes to all those women. He doesn't have to accept all those women. And it's kind of, in a weird way, it's sort of, going by that logic, it's kind of taking an abusive relationship and the effects it has and sort of subverting it to the male gender, where usually it's referred back to the female gender. What I mean by that is that in a lot of stories I've read, you have a toxic relationship with a male and female character, right? Where the male character is very toxic and the female character is abused, or she's either abused or she is abandoned or treated poorly, right? So what ends up happening is that the female character, she comes to accept literally any guy that is going to treat her halfway decent. She's just like, yes, be in a relationship with me. It has to be better than that first toxic relationship. And it often leads to poor decisions, right? It often leads to situations where there may not be mutual love, or it may not end well, or it may just, you know, not lead to the most fulfillment that that female character could have, right? But she is accepting all these other people in her life because they're showing her compassion, whereas she's not used to that. So she'll just accept anything that comes to her remotely showing kindness. Here, MXTX is almost giving that, only it's subverting it to where it's a male character who's been abused, and so he'll just accept anybody with compassion that takes him in, including like any female that joins his harem. So that's interesting. But as Shin tells us, he says he could only say that, as expected, the brilliant protagonist truly was overwhelmingly cool, awesome, insane, and badass, with a dick longer than the heavens. Again, magic fingers, dicks longer than the heavens. The Shin bottom agenda is writing itself, but we'll see where that goes, right? So Lo, I love that he tries to blame himself and he thinks that Shin is going to get onto him and how pitiful he looks. And then he's like, take me to the place where Ning vanished. And so they go to that bustling corridor. And so then we have the easy mode that's activated. And again, I feel like Shin was like, oh, well, I'll just figure. I like that Shin tells us, though, he does say that he is not Sherlock Holmes. Shin is like, I'm no Sherlock Holmes. I'm not a master of deduction. I don't like this deep analytical thought. I just know like short-term things like this. But I can't infer multitudes of facts from a single clue. If I'm in an escape room or a detective game, I run into dead ends, which explains why he's so oblivious. We're over here as the audience being like, are you seeing the red flags? Are you deducing all the clues that are being thrown in your face? The answer is no. And I'm really grateful that MXTX gives us this character work with him to be like, no, he's not a detective. He is not like Modao Zushi or Heaven Official's Blessing. He's like, I don't get these clues and pick them up. I'm just doing short-term, like, figuring stuff out. I love that we get that character work. So, we get the idea that Shin is not a detective. That is important to note. And we have the idea of the B points being deducted. So they're like, would you want to spend 100 B points to activate easy mode? Which he does. And that leaves him with 65 points. And honestly, the easy mode was such a waste. It wasn't helpful at all. So it's like, oh no. And what does it do? It just, instead what's interesting is in the Donghua, they went back to where they started from. But in this, in the novel, they go to a haunted house with like the white paper lanterns, the dilapidated gates. It's a haunted, neglected house. I feel like the Donghua just didn't have the budget to make a new place. And they had they already had an existing CGI model of the mansion. So they just went back to the mansion. I mean, case in point, the point is it wasn't much of an easy mode and they still got caught by the boss. Go figure. But I'm a little bit surprised that in the novel, Lo is just looking behind Shin and then the ghost and the foul wind blows past and that's it. We don't get the longing as Shin falls to the ground and Lo's like reaching for him. We don't get that. That's in the Donghua. Again, the Donghua is like amping up the shipping way more than the novel at this point. So here's the problem. They wake up and he's in a foul mood and he was straight into the boss's mouth. It's like the easy mode was merciless. And the worst part was he'd been struck down by a mini boss and shortly thereafter it was like out of character, B points, -50. And he's like, son of a bitch. I was like -50 points because he got beaten by a mini boss. I do think that's a little bit bad. I was like, damn. Now he's down to 15 points before he dies. So he's at the end of his rope. At the end of chapter 6, our poor boy, Shin, has gone from 170 points down to 15. This is not promising. And I feel like it's the system being like, bitch, you can't cheat your way through this. You have to experience it. And I feel like it was the novel's way of saying, look, you had all these opportunities. If you had stuck to, you were going to end up here anyway. It's a haunted house. It's obvious that that's where the ghost is. So if you had just done the regular mode and didn't activate the easy mode, you could have experienced more time with Lo, which could have helped you possibly, you know, further your relationship with him. But no, you chose the easy way out and now you're getting punished. Oh my God. But here he says he had been stripped naked. Now, does stripped naked mean he's full on naked, like his golden finger is hanging out in the breeze, or is it like Donmai naked, where you've got a thin cloth on? I'm always amazed at how they're like, oh, I'm naked, and I'm like, you're wearing a shirt that's like what I'm wearing now, but okay, your chesticles are visible, so we'll just let it go. Oh my God, I talked for a good 50 minutes about this. Awesome. I didn't know how much discussion I would get out of these 2 chapters that were relatively short, but okay. I am loving this novel so far. So, as far as our B points that we need to address, changing the nonsensical plot, well, we're working towards that. We're working towards trying to save Ming Fan and Lo as well. Avoiding landmines that break the suspension of disbelief. Well, we're not doing too well with that because we've lost a lot of B points because we were captured by a mini boss because we tried to do easy mode. Yikes. Although maintaining the character satisfaction and hidden plot events, we're doing pretty good on that, I think. And we're learning what the magic finger is. We'll just have to see it in action later as we go, right? as we go. Also, I'm going to point out a little bit of a sexual symbolism here. If we're talking about magic finger, putting it into the jar, you can figuratively reimagine that as the finger and the jar being low and shins. I'm going to stop right now. Y'all, we only got through 2 chapters this week, but I am thoroughly happy. I don't know if I'm going to wait till I get to the comments before I read the next set, so we'll just have to see what my schedule looks like and go from there. So, in the meantime, if I do end up reading the next set of chapters, I'm sorry. But in the meantime, I hope y'all enjoyed this reaction discussion. I can't wait to hear your thoughts down below, but I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe. Take care. I'm going to put this on to Conspiracy Board Sama and take a portrait to put on the Discord. Probably the Sunday before this chapter comes out. So we'll just see what we get. But in any case, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe. Take care. And yeah, I'll be back very soon with more Scum Villains Self-Saving System. Bye!